Welcome all this evening to another edition of the Truth Gangsters podcast. This evening will be a very special edition. There is an old Ethiopian folk tale which goes as follows. One day, the Ethiopian governor of Harar, Ras Makanen, received a prophecy. This prophecy concerned his wife, who had up to this point faced considerable reproductive challenges, including multiple miscarriages. The prophecy stated that the child his wife was carrying is a son who would be born healthy and grow to be a smart and diligent boy. Once this boy became a young man, he would rise to become the ruler of Ethiopia, and under his leadership, this country would rise to power and greatness and be respected across the world. The prophecy, however, contained one caveat that despite his son's great achievements, he would ultimately destroy all that he built with his own hands and leave the country in ruins. This folktale does not or cannot even begin to adequately describe the life and legacy of the man who is the subject of tonight's discussion. But it certainly brings into sharp focus the varying views of his life, legacy, his importance, and his meaning. Born on July 23rd, 1892, Rastafari Makanen, His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie I, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah, and elect of God. A controversial figure, perhaps, lauded as a dignified and fearless statesman, a devoted and uncompromising Pan Africanist, military genius and strategist, a man who for many represented liberation for Black people globally, and for many others still, even in his homeland, was seen as an oppressive tyrant, an imperialist, and even for many more, he was seen as God incarnate. So let us discuss this man. I have some interesting guests who are joining me this evening who are eager to discuss this and to talk about this dignified emperor, king, leader, many see as a god. So, welcome all. Thank you for joining tonight's discussion. I want to start off with this Ethiopian folktale. Greetings, Dr. Kimo. Greetings, Rashawn. Greetings, Kush, Leighton, everyone in the chat. Dr. Kimo, this folktale that was allegedly told to Haile Selassie's father, how much of this do you feel or do you know to be true? Or is this just another case of European propaganda to weaken the image of a great African king?
Greetings, one and all. Hope you're hearing me.
Hearing you loud and clear.
Yes. Well, I have read the folklore also, but I have no proof of what they say of the part of destroying Ethiopia. I remember clearly upon his arrest, and when he wept and said, "I have done so much for my country, and yet you see me as somebody that is evil." So I have no proof, but it's as His Majesty speak about propaganda also. The propagandists them very numerous right throughout the ages. because they know who he was and because they could not destroy him mentally, spiritually, or physically, they spread that propaganda. So I have no proof of what they say about breaking down or destroying Ethiopia if it is a truth or fact. That is just their words.
Speaking of propaganda, I want to jump in head first with perhaps the most well known tale or story that Haile Selassie, in response to questions about his divinity, especially as it relates to the Rastafari community or the Rastafari faith, that he was alleged to have said that he is not God and that he denied any association with any deification of himself. You want to address for me, please, just break down for everyone listening the divinity of Haile Selassie and why he's deified among many.
So far we know when His Majesty came to Ethiopia, to Jamaica, 1966, I think, 21st of April 1966. Somebody, it was, to me, it sounded like it was a harder given. Tell them that you are not God. His word was, who am I to interfere with their beliefs? That was also printed in the newspaper, which has been hidden or hide all these decades. It did no such thing. You cannot deny who you really is. Because if you look at the title again, Kings of Kings, Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah, Elect of God, and Light of the World. If you just look at that title alone, just that title, Elect, it goes as far to say, none was found in heaven, none on the earth, and none under the earth. But weep not, behold the conquering lion of the tribe of Judah, elect. So, His Majesty say humans should not believe that they are emanated from a deity. That means we were created. He's not like us. These gods, and if you notice, it's elect by God. He's a God. Likewise, we are. The Bible states it also. Ye are all gods, but shall die like men. His Majesty actually never dropped flesh, and so he could not deny who he is. Because for you to drop flesh, that means you are just a mortal, puny being. And that never happened to him. There's another propaganda spread that he denied. He didn't. That's another lie, you know.
Thank you for that. Rashon, welcome again. Can you speak a little bit more on the concept of the divinity of Haile Selassie, why he's seen as God incarnate, and
Greetings,
what is.
everyone.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, excuse me, sorry about that. Yeah, so greetings, everyone.
Bless up, brother.
In regards to the question, I would say there are many perspectives, right, to the divinity, viewed by the divinity, or on the topic when concerning the divinity of His Majesty, because we can, most of us Farai, we choose to take the Judeo-Christian perspective of biblical texts and these kind of things, but to go even further, to an ancient African or a Cushitic perspective, so every king that sat upon the throne of ancient Ethiopia was seen as a divine being only if their actions match the titles, meaning that the Romans or the Vatican, they have a concept called imitatio Dei, which means to imitate God or to be God-like through your actions. And in ancient Ethiopia, we have a concept called that they stole, or their concept originated from. It's called Earth Mira. Earth Mira means to emulate divinity or godliness through righteousness. And every pharaoh who sat upon the throne, or every emperor who sat upon the throne of ancient Ethiopia, they were entrusted with the duty to act in righteousness to substantiate the titles or the divine titles, right? So that's the first, the African perspective of divinity, which in it's not something supernatural as according to the Europeans where people with powers. No, but it's actually within the actions or the act of righteousness, we emulate divinity, you know? So from that perspective, His Majesty is God because he sat upon the throne and he acted in righteousness, fulfilling the divine titles and acclamations and like, you know, names and accords given to him. From a Judeo perspective, yes, he is God or he is the Messiah, which is the anointed one, which means to be anointed by holy oils according to the order of King David and Solomon and so forth. So, yes, he is the anointed one. He is the Messiah or the chosen one, the divine being, according to that perspective as well. But because the Judeo perspective is so limited, when I mean limited, it only goes back to a certain time frame, and the origin of the Judeo Christian perspective can be found in the Nile Valley culture. You know, so like I said, there's many reasons, but according to the Christian text now or the Bible, in the book of Revelation, John approached the angel, right, and he worshipped him. He fell at his feet to worship him, and he said, worship me not, like, because I'm a follower of Christ just like you, you know. And I think in that perspective, when, you know, many people came to His Majesty and they said, are you him, are you him, just like the scripture said, now he was able to substantiate that and say, I'm a follower of Christ, you know. Because at many times we like to, as Rastafari, we love to romanticize and we love to get caught up and somewhat argue and say, you know, he said this, he said that, but it's actually hearsay. But when we read the actual text of His Majesty, he tells us, no, like the elder said, Kimo, Dr. Kimo said that, you know, no human being emulates from a deity. And he tells us plain and simple, this European concept of God, or which comes from a German word, which means to invoke or to invoke a spirit, right? We don't relate to that. Our divinity is actually, you know, calculated differently. It's not by where you say you are or where you claim you are, right? But actually based upon what you do. And it goes even further to the scripture where it's like words without works cannot sustain.
Thank you for that, Rashawn. And that's very interesting because so many people have said that Rastafari is a contradiction in terms, especially for those Rasta who say, for example, in Jamaica, them said, them bun Bible, or the black people who say Bible is white man fairy tales. But at the same time, they are using this book, which they themselves have discredited, to justify the divinity of Haile Selassie. So I really appreciate the fact that you were able to take it outside of the biblical context and go back historically from a African worldview. Kush, what is your perspective on this idea of Haile Selassie being divine, whether through the history that we know of or ancestral concepts of divinity, or biblically, as Rashawn had broken it down?
Greetings, everyone. Thanks again for having me, Kish. Um, yeah, that was a good description of how His Majesty is seen as or is identified within the Rastafari movement. Um, it's we would say it's almost like a reaction to what was going on. Of course, it has to because we needed a reaction to the exploitation, spiritual, physical, um, economical exploitation that was going on after the African people. And one of the reasons why Judeo-Christian or the Judeo-Christian avenue was taken, it was also because it was one of the dominant things that was allowed for the people to study. And the ones and ones found Africa and His Majesty still through that book, even though they were basically burning it out in some aspect. Leonard Howell would if you read some of Leonard Old's writings, he wouldn't make you know straight that Adam and Eve is the devil, or they're the sons and daughters of white people, and they have nothing to do with black people, you know. So they were the ones who were able to find Africa and His Majesty, who trace his lineage not only through Solomon but through Makeda, which we would say is through pure African blood. Questionable, but through pure African blood, outside of the biblical tracing through Solomon. But what it did, it gave the ones who were taking it on a Judeo-Christian perspective still to have a foothold in Africa, or in their soul that Africa is the place and African culture is the place, because they still found it through the Bible. And the ones that was blooding out the Bible was still able to find that through the same Haile Selassie and Africa without using the Bible. So, at the end, whatever we use, whether we go through the Bible, whether we go through history or archaeological study, it's still going to lead us to Ethiopia, or that region, Sudan, all that region was controlled by Ethiopia, or under that control. And Haile Selassie will fall right in the middle of that lineage that lead us right back to all our ancestors. So, I think that's how it got to, for him to become that God within the Rastafari movement, and that messenger or messiah, which some would say would come through the answering of Garvey. I guess when Garvey was asking where is the black man king and where is the black man kingdom, and there it was the crowning of a king. And African culture, as we know, your king is always, or African normally turn their king into their gods and their gods into their kings. So it's nothing far fetched.
Thank you. The Christian, black Christian, especially in Jamaica, seem overly preoccupied with asking Rasta outside of any other religion. They don't do it to the Muslims. They don't do it to, you know, any other group. But they are preoccupied with asking Rasta to justify why Haile Selassie is seen as a god, or as the god, as their god. And a lot of times, Rasta spend a lot of time trying to justify this. Is this necessary, Dr. Kim, or is this holding the movement back? This time, this constant explaining and trying to justify Haile Selassie's divinity.
Good question. It's something, is like a debacle. It's constant confusion. But whenever time anyone asks why, like personalized to say, why you say King Selassie as a god? In our African history, there are many gods. That is the reality. We are not well studied to understand it all like how them ask the question. But what we know so far, we revere this individual because of his work, his ability to unite Africa, as them call him the father of Africa. No other king we know of has done that, but he did it. He's not just a normal person. Personally, for me, and through my explanation to many more people who ask this question, His Imperial Majesty Emperor King Selassie I is just not a normal man, regardless of how many people might just see him as a king, but he's not just a king. Have heard. This being is from a different cycle. They don't live and die like men do. They are superior force to be reckoned with. And so it's kind of hard to express or explain itself to a normal person who does see him as a man. And we understand, so they have to see him that because they don't know him. And why we say know him, if you know somebody like you know your mother or your father, you really know them behavior pattern, them attributes, or them talk, or them sound. You know the person, like you know your mother, like how you like your curry chicken. And so you understand that. These people who ask this question, it's kind of hard to explain to them. God, them get so boisterous for you just to break down things. They must say, yeah, ye that you food. But you know, get vexed. Guys, Majesty teach us about humility and humbleness. But if you know him, even a Rasta man who can't express or break it down physically, mentally, spiritually to another individual who may be more intellectual at the research of them find. Even those people good and revere him as this masterful God, the king still look upon them as somebody very important. That is how we look at His Majesty as a God, one of the gods. Because to we have many gods. But all these gods is a part of what we call the all. But there's a supreme entity or a great force His Majesty speak about also. And when we study, we find out there's that supreme force what creates all things. Yeah. So we might try to find the best way to explain to people. As an example, my father is a pastor, and he grew up in a church as a pastor's son, and now jump off of the Jesus train and jump to Rastafari train. It kind of like daddy, yes. But when we reason about Jesus and Rastafari, because if we really check good, most people don't even know who Yeshua Hamashiach is when them really even calling him, but they revere that his son. I personally, I always say Yeshua Hamashiach, which we call Jesus, is the son of His Imperial Majesty. You know, if we go look deeper into even Psalms 87, this and that man was born in earth. And so even sometimes we try to use that to explain to people that if you look at the situation and study it a little deeper, you will say, yes, these entities are superior, supreme beings. But not everybody we can really break it down for them to understand. So sometimes the conversation or the question them left unanswered because them not really swallow we really give them, until the question come back again and the same thing start. Some will come around and some will think about it. I try to do them research. Some won't because they hold on to what they hold on upon. But to me, it's simple. His Majesty set certain parameters and bars we live by: good, ethics, love, mercy, compassion. And if we live by this, regardless of how much we study and know, if we just live by this entity, we're pretty much gone in the book. If we can really live how him want we live and the example where he said that we live by, it's pretty much good like that, whether they believe or not, we said to them.
Thank you for that, Dr. Kimo. Rashawn, Kimo mentioned the fact that we have multiple gods, multiple spiritual expressions all across the continent of Africa. But a criticism that has been made often about persons who look to Africa for guidance and spiritual guidance, etc., is why do we focus on Ethiopia and Egypt? Why is there an obsession, or some would call a romanticization, of places like Egypt, Ethiopia, when you have the gods of Yoruba, West African spiritual traditions? Some have said it's a matter of colorism, it's a matter of focusing on the areas that Europeans or invaders deem as important. Do you think that's a fair criticism? Do you think we're overly obsessed as Black people with Egypt and Ethiopia and have forgotten our West African traditions?
Yeah, give thanks again. First, I just want to address for the other question prior, as far as, is it stagnating Rastafari to argue with Christians about the divinity of His Majesty? So first, I want to say it's simple. Like, personally, my view is that Rastafari is all about the black man seeing God within himself. We see man exalted, man, the man of his imperial majesty exalted to emperor, which is the highest status a man can be, right? A king, and above a king is an emperor. That's the highest status a man can reach in this realm, in this world. And when we see man in his highest status or highest rank exalted to that of divinity, now we see God within ourselves as black men, as African men. So I think the biggest problem with most of us is not even just a Christian concept, but just black man in general, is that we fail to see God within ourselves. That's why most of us argue and fight and want to argue about the divinity of His Majesty, and most Christians attack Rastafari. And it leads me to the text or the scripture where Christ is in the, I think, in the field, and the people them approach him and says, what if somebody dies and on the Sabbath and so on and so forth? And Christ says to them, let the dead bury the dead, let the dead bury the dead. He didn't literally mean it, but he actually meant it in this concept of where we see Christians questioning us and, tempting us in this constant dialogue that has no resolution, is because, they're, most of them are dead in spirit, So when they see the living ones, they approach us and question us in those regards. But same way that the Christ responded in the Bible, let the dead bury the dead. That's how I view it, because it is a stagnant vibration. And going forward now to the question you just asked, um, I would say, to take it even more further now, even you about the gods now, Ethiopia is, you could say, romanticized by us because Ethiopia was the only place that wasn't colonized by the European. They only occupied it, and during the occupation, it was a struggle throughout. So I think that's one of the reasons why we glorify Ethiopia, because even the scriptures tell us glorious things are spoken of thee, and within that regards, Ethiopia is the holder of the Ark of the Covenant. Ethiopia was never colonized. The first human being remains was found in Ethiopia, what they call Lucy, or we call Decanesh. So many things are spoken about Ethiopia. Ethiopia is the mighty, the glorious place, the black man's kingdom. And we bypass West Africa, a lot of us, because um, we go straight to the head. Kwame Nkrumah, when you read what he personally said about His Imperial Majesty and Ethiopia, Kwame Nkrumah glorified Ethiopia. And Kwame Nkrumah was the first prime minister of Ghana, West Africa, where most of us can trace our descent from. And if Kwame Nkrumah now was conscious enough and awakened enough to see the light that His Majesty was shining, that was brighter than any other, and to acknowledge it, who are we to fight against that? You got to know the master and know your maker in that sense of the term. And Kwame Nkrumah knew who had the power, knew Ethiopia. And in fact, Ethiopia, when you do the studies and you check and you do your research, you check Ethiopia was financing Kwame Nkrumah's revolution. Ethiopia was financing what's his name, Mandela in South Africa. He literally brought Mandela to Ethiopia secretly and trained him, gave him military training, and gave him a specific gun to go and fight apartheid with. Ethiopia financed the Mama warriors, and His Majesty was using the resources from Europe that they was giving him, and everybody was trying to flatter and flirt with him for Ethiopia's resources. And in exchange, he was giving it to the revolutionary and liberation movements throughout the continent. That's why JFK, in that speech when His Majesty came and they received him in Washington, D.C., he said that His Majesty alone is responsible for the decolonization of over 30 African nations in 10 years. Because His Majesty was that character in his wisdom and his knowledge, that he was, shaking hands with the Europeans, where some at home was like, oh, he loved the white boy, and then at the same time, strengthening his brothers and sisters against colonialism. Even I was born in Guyana, and my prime minister at the time, Forbes Burnham, which is the first prime minister of Guyana, he went to a non-alignment movement meeting somewhere in Europe, and on his stop after the meeting, the conference, he went to meet His Majesty because he heard he was nearby, and he implemented certain anti-colonial gestures and movements. He nationalized our mineral wealth in the land, and he started to focus more on agriculture, because this was the time when we was fighting and saying, okay, I'm independent, I'm liberating myself from the Queen and the King of England, because Ethiopia was that force behind us. You know, Ethiopia is, the, like His Majesty said, the black man's citadel, our last hope on earth. And if Ethiopia is conquered, then the world would change. And literally, that's what it was. Everywhere on planet Earth was colonized by the European. From China, Australia, Japan, you name it, was colonized by them. And Ethiopia was the last place on planet Earth that was not conquered. And in regards to the gods concept, I would say that when we study African spirituality more, we realize that there's only one God, even within the Ifa spirituality or the Yoruba spiritual system. Oludumare is the only God and the only creator. But Oludumare manifests himself throughout nature and throughout all, you know, like living things and the elements. So therefore, these are aspects or are into what you call intermediates between the creator. In Africa, and most spiritual systems in Africa, you don't speak directly to the creator. You have to go through like an intermediate or a messenger, or angel. Even in Ethiopia, when you go there, they don't pray directly to Exile. They usually pray to Mariam, which is the mother of Christ, or Mary, or they pray to an archangel, and that archangel in return, or Mary, you know, sends the message on to you. And it's the same thing in Ethiopia, the oldest Christian nation, where you would think that, okay, one church is like exactly the same throughout the country. No, in Ethiopia, there's different regions, and every region has like a guiding angel over that region. In the south, Gabriel guides the south. In the north, another angel guards it. And Ethiopian, they glorify and venerate these angels as divine beings as well.
Thanks for that, Rashawn. Something you said piqued my interest. Well, many things, but in particular, when you said or when you mentioned one of the reasons why Ethiopia is glorified is because it was the only state to have not been colonized by invaders. And I've heard that many times before from Rasis and even other Ethiopianists and Pan Africanists. I wonder though if this concept of giving respect to the people or the nation that was not defeated is problematic or can be problematic. And let me tell you why I say that. So many times I hear black people speak negatively of themselves because they were quote unquote conquered or defeated by the white man. And so is it that our respect or reverence is reserved for the people who won, or do we not owe an inherent reverence and respect to all African nations and civilizations, irrespective of what side they fell in the war? I mean, the war is ongoing. There are many people who would argue that Ethiopia has been conquered or was conquered in some way. So I just find that to be a slippery slope. I don't know, Kush, if you have any thoughts on that or if you wanted to add to what Rashawn said.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Um, because it can be said that the colonization of Ethiopia was through Christianity. Um, Again, but it can be said that Ethiopia was allowed. All right, let's take out the word allowed. Ethiopia. The reason for saying Ethiopia has not been colonized or leaning to Ethiopia is because that within that context of colonization through Christianity, Ethiopia still practice this concept on a state level without interference or without dictation. So even though they adopted We're not 100% sure on what date Christianity went into Ethiopia, but we know that it went into Ethiopia. So they were practicing this concept upon within their own um, identity. So even though they were reading, you have the Bible or the concept of the Bible, you still have the glory of the kings, which will give you the Ethiopian version of the visit to King Solomon through a different perspective. So again, they're giving their history or giving the history through their own lens, not with the influence of Europeans or invaders. So I'm saying that that is a discussion that needs to be had because it will allow us to analyze what is Ethiopian history, what is African history in comparison to what was brought in with invaders. But yeah, the colonization, I think it, Ethiopia was one of those places that gave black people across the world dignity. So when all of Africa was flag was being waved through European country, Ethiopia was the only country that was waving an African flag. So there's some reason why black people find Ethiopia. I would say Ethiopia was not colonized because we had a black king that was the white man was bowing down before that wasn't happening anywhere in Africa.
Yes, but Kush, why is the respect for an African king dependent on whether a white man is
Not
bowing to
oh
him?
That it wasn't
I would
dependent on him now. Remember that within that time frame, when we're studying or analyzing Rastafari as a move, we have to also analyze the time frame and environment. Within that time frame and environment, black people was severely oppressed, and it was the only visual evidence or visuality that black people had of an African king that the so-called greatest white nations were bowing before. So it wasn't they didn't go to Haile Selassie because of white nation, but the idea that even when they found Haile Selassie through their own consciousness, the white nations had to be bowing before the king that they were saying that they were king, that there's their king and their God. So it gave black people, the Rastafari, and also black people across the world a sense of pride that an African king that was, as them say, not colonized through physical colonization, that was practicing their own culture. Because even though Christianity is within Ethiopia, there are a lot of other ethnic groups within Ethiopia that wasn't practicing Christianity, that was practicing their traditional African spirituality. It just wasn't at state level, which that's how a state run. There's certain things at state level, there's certain things at not state level, which you can call them bourgeoisies, but it just wasn't at state level. So it was a pride for all black people across the world. Additionally, the concept that Rastafari was idolizing Ethiopia over everywhere else is not necessarily correct in the sense that Rastafari had to they had to say Ethiopia. That's where the god and the king was from. That's where the lineage that lead through Ethiopia, right? But additionally, Rastafari within the early days. So Naya Bingi, she's from Nigeria. Rastafari also connected to the Mama warriors, which is from Kenya. So, and whole heap of other concept that was being brought within the Rastafari movement as it evolved into its Africanness, it it took elements from majority different parts of Africa, which was rebelling against imperialism and colonization, and also took a lot of its influence from parts of Africa that was not necessarily fighting against European, but embracing its Africanness. You know, but it was a process over a period of time. So yeah, Ethiopia had to be represented as the groundation because, as I say, without without archaeological evidence or historical evidence, Rastafari could still identify Ethiopian. And if we go back to what Ethiopia was, it was also Sudan, it was all that region was considered as Ethiopia or underneath that
Yes,
ruling.
and of course, the entire continent was once referred to as Ethiopia. So I get that.
Exactly, and not only through just reference, it was politically, the seat was within that area of Ethiopia. So and the concept, because all so that's why I'm saying that Ethiopia had to be um, seen as special, and also
It
Rastafari
didn't
took
have to be, but it certainly was. Rashon, you wanted to respond?
Yes, I just wanted to add in what the brother Kush was saying that historically speaking, Ethiopia is the oldest nation on planet Earth, right? And just like how the Europeans they romanticize and glorify Greek culture because that's their ancient culture. They all European culture stems from Greco-Roman culture. They're the mother culture, and the same thing for Africans. All African culture stem from Ethiopian Egyptian culture. Our origins are on the Nile Valley, and the Egyptians were a colony of the Ethiopians. It said that when Egypt rose, Ethiopia was already old, over 10,000 years old. Even as far as West Africa, in the Yoruba culture, they have a Orisha called Shango. And Shango, according to ancient texts, he was an Ethiopian prince that journeyed from Ethiopia to West Africa, and that's what the historical text teaches us. So all Africans trace their historical lineage back to the Nile Valley or back to the Ethiopian region and kingdom, just like how the Europeans can trace back to Rome and Greece. It's said that Zeus, the king of the Greek gods, used to travel to Ethiopia to dwell and to eat amongst them because they were the most upright and righteous men on planet Earth. And it's the same way they romanticize most youths in the diaspora. They could tell you who Hercules is. They could tell you all the Greek gods, but they don't know nothing of African gods or the concepts of the deities in Africa. And it's the same way where African people, we glorify, romanticize Ethiopia and ancient Egypt because that's our mother culture. Just like how Greece is the mother of Rome and Rome broke into the European countries, same thing with Africa and Ethiopia.
Thank you. Kimo, did you want to respond to that point?
Well, everything is well said. What I would say though, if you look at the speech that was made, I think it was 1930, that until the philosophy, if you notice in there, say, until the basic human rights are equally guaranteed to all without regards to race. So if you just pick out that line, as much as we are Africans, we are also come underneath the rim or the banner of a human. And so this human consciousness that we have come from our father. If you look at the war when he was fighting, he employed Russians, Americans, Chinese, Korean, everybody actually employed to fight in his war against the enemy. That goes to show you he ain't holding no form of grudge. But at one point, the whole entire earth was Africa, or Kush or Al Kebulan. But at one point also, we were all brothers. And since the Almighty God Himself created this entire earth, not just Ethiopia or Nigeria, but America, England, Europe, in reality, is Africa. As a matter of fact, the name Europe is really an African queen name. And so the entire, you could say, if it was in Africa or America, but with just borderline comes in and the devil just jump in and put up his wire fence and part off and say, well, you take this and you take this. But in reality, for me, I look at a earthly understanding to enough levels. In Encounter His Majesty one time, I kind of get a perspective of most things that is really far and what him really details in him life or him see earth as a human being. Because we kind of want to have this peace and this harmony regardless of what the imperial powers has really done to us. We're not going to repay them the same treatment but them give us. It would make us less than what we really are.
But we
So
Africans will fight. We find it necessary. Let's not
we
forget the
no, that's
military
it,
aspect
right.
of His
No,
Majesty.
we cannot forget that. That comes right now. But when I disregard nothing in that speech that he made, nothing at all, everything have to plainly work out right. But just as he said, that until the color of a man's skin is so we have good people who are white, just like we have evil people who are black, if you understand what I'm saying. So he looked through all of that and he chose the good and he chose the bad and he try to fix the bad also. So that is just my intake and the whole thing right there. So
Okay, thank you for that, Dr. Kimo. Kush spoke a lot about the impact and relevance of Haile Selassie having to do with the state of black people globally at the time of his birth, at the time of his coronation, at the time of his rule. Widespread suffering, colonization, suffering under imperialism, suffering under European domination, racism, etc., etc. And a big part of the communist movement, the African communist movement or the African socialist movement, stemmed from some of the issues that African people globally were facing. My question, though, is there a contradiction between saying or fighting for communism, socialism, anti capitalism, anti imperialism, while at the same time worshipping or honoring or deifying an emperor, a man who, in his country, at some point during his reign, there were still slaves? We talk about the cries of the Tigray people and the people who were the ethnic, so-called ethnic minorities, and the fact that they felt that they were ignored by the state rule, the emperor rule at the time. How does Rastafari make sense of that? How do we marry the two concepts? Fighting against imperialism at home, but hailing imperialism in Ethiopia. Anyone want to take Rashon?
Yes, I would say that it is a contradiction as far as communism and monarchy is concerned. And as we know, in the coup d'etat or the Red Terror that Haile Mengistu led was a communist movement, and they were the ones who deposed the emperor, right? And that is definitely against Ethiopianism, right? Ethiopianism is based and originated in a monarchy, in a divine monarchy. So yes, it is a contradiction, but most Rastafari, we are not communists. We might hold the ideas of for the people, but though that consciousness existed before communism, before the Russians conceived those ideas. So I would say that there is a distinction between communists and Rastafari. Rastafari believe that yes, the people, government for the people and by the people and so forth, and that's why even His Imperial Majesty changed the laws in Ethiopia, where prior to His Majesty, the monarch had absolute power and absolute rule. But through growth and wisdom, he was able to create a constitution, Ethiopia's first constitution, and also to divide government in between, cabinets and something like a Congress, and the division of power, even the slaves, the so-called slaves. When His Majesty took power, Ethiopia is an ancient nation, and they had rules and laws that was established before, before His Majesty ruled. So he had to even go against tradition and break those rules and teach his people and teach the Ethiopians, like, listen, it's not okay to enslave your brothers. So His Majesty shows the fullness and the completion of consciousness as far as how we supposed to act as Africans. His Majesty came to Ethiopia and broke many rules. He fought against the church. The church, they said the church was one of the biggest enemies of Ethiopia because of His Majesty, because His Majesty took away majority of the church land. And who used to serve or work on the land? It was the majority of Oromo people, which make up most of the population of Ethiopia. And they would call them in a derogative term, and they would call them Gullah. All right, they would call them Gullahs, and Gullah means like slave. And His Majesty took the Oromo people and created his personal military or imperial guard with those people and gave them power. Even Haile Mengistu, who fought against His Majesty, turned his back. He was Oromo, and His Majesty gave him rankings in his military and so forth. So I would say it's only a contradiction to those who are active communists and then say Rastafari, or who, those who practice those ways. But to a Rastafari who is conscious of himself and where he comes from and the ideas and concepts that he lived by, he would know that it's two different things. Communism and the way of Rastafari are two different things.
Thank you, Rashawn. Kush, Pan Africanism and communism goes hand in hand? And if so, can a Rasta truly be a Pan Africanist?
And all right. So before I go into it, I want to first would define what is these terms, because they're very dangerous. Especially Jamaican people, are very afraid of these terms, communism and socialism, right? Communism and socialism, which, if we define it through in the African perspective, um, let's define it. It is where the mass of the people control their production. The mass of the people are in control of the means of production. That's basically what it is. These, if the mass of the people is in control of the means of the production, probably the mass of the people need a vanguard, some as an entity that speaks on behalf of the people. So we can say that mode of operandi need outlet, and you have a person. So we can say the imperial state of Ethiopia was that, because so that is what I think socialism or communism is, right? Now, imperialism, again, I think His Majesty, when he opened his book, when he was in his autobiography, when he was talking, he specifically said he's going to still use the word imperialism or the imperial government, because imperialism is take on a different meaning when it goes into Europe, because imperialism in Europe is not, because we don't have a problem with imperial governments in Europe. We have a problem because the imperial government as Europe is exploiting Africa and other um, countries in the world. That's a problem we have with imperial government and imperialists. That's what they're doing. In Ethiopia, there was not an exploitation of the people to produce anything. The government wasn't doing that. Of course, they were part of the elite group. Um, and His Majesty was having issue with that. So before His Majesty, there were emperors that tried to get rid of what they call slavery. The idea of, if you're in war with the next nation, or a next nation try to invade you, or people trade other human beings. We can talk about the morality of it, but if these things were happening, there were emperors before Haile Selassie that was trying to get rid of this. Now, of course, the elite class, which are we can label them also bourgeoisie class within Ethiopia, was benefiting from this. They were benefiting from the fact that you had a group of people that would come in and would probably help you on your farm to produce food for both you and them. They will come in and they will become a part of the government and they will help you to overthrow different nations. So even slavery in its context was totally different. But the fact is that His Majesty and other emperors tried to get rid of this. And the elite saw a benefit and made it difficult. So if communism and socialism mean that the mass of the people control the means of production, and in Ethiopia there was the imperial government was not exploiting the people or control the mass or control the means of production, in person to each person personally, then there is no contradiction because we can state that the government was the vanguard, which the government should be. No matter what kind of system you have, you will have a vanguard, and the government should be the vanguard. So there's no I don't see any contradiction between Rastafari going along with the idea of socialism and still having putting up Haile Selassie as their king and god.
Interesting. Dr. Kimo, in Jamaica, there is a concept that expresses itself through slang known as Palace Pitney. And Rasta refer to themselves as Palace Pitney. It's a symbol of exceptionalism. It's a symbol of you being special and you being a child of His Majesty. And to me, if anything else, if nothing else, that slang alone encapsulates this idea that to be part of the monarchy in Ethiopia meant that you were better than. You were better than the mass of the people. You were royal, you were privileged, you were upper class. How is that not in direct contradiction to many of the concepts which Rasta revolutionary thought? Fight against Babylon, burn down classism, burn down this. How is that not in contradiction with those thoughts?
It is in contradiction because if you see yourself better than another human being, you're contradicting yourself. All men are equal in the sight of God. And since we're all humans, as His Majesty say, humans must depend on the Almighty God because we are puny creatures. So we're still learning. We're still on a journey to rise. His Majesty also said, man can rise to the summit, to the heights of angels. That means we can conquer death and live forever. So it's a journey. Any man seems self-righteous. His Majesty also said, any man think that he has learned enough and say he need no more is a fool. So we're on the journey of life, searching and seeking for our higher self. If a man see himself as a palace child and think him special, him just wrong. He said also, one day every man will meet his maker and answer for his work. So with that said, just that little part, if I go meet my maker and answer for what I do, then I must look at the laws that His Majesty has set, the foundation that him established, who him really is, him attributes, him behavior, how him live. Not for we as Rasta, we can talk a lot of things, but living the life is the opposite. Now me born a Jamaica and from me a youth, me know Rasta. And me join in upon it, learn so much things from some elderly Rasta. We meet enough of them from my 20, enough of them they already 70 years old, who bring me into this understanding. But what I learned from it is the morals that His Majesty stand for, his behavior, how him live him life. And we see somebody live truthful, just like the European them narrate, them say, behold the perfect man that walk the earth. Now for we not reach to say it, and we don't even know if we're going to reach there for now. But let's say 1,000 miles begins with one step. So we can never at any time rise ourselves above no other human being. God, all human beings on the planet is just a human being. No palace child. You are just another human being. If you live the life, exemplary life, and you can rise the bar to the highest, then that's beautiful. Somebody can copy you or follow you and emulate you and will learn from you and try to do our best in that sense. That is how I see it.
Give thanks, Dr. Kimo. Rashan, I know you have visited Ethiopia many times. I think, if I'm not mistaken, you may have lived there for some time, but you can correct me. But I know I have met Ethiopians who have a very negative view of Haile Selassie. And they see him as a tyrant, they see him as a despot. Tell us about the anti Haile Selassie sentiment that exists in Ethiopia and why you think that is.
Well, yes, definitely. There is an anti Haile Selassie sentiment in Ethiopia. And when I was there, I would question them and ask them. And what I realized or came to understand was that after the Derg or the Red Terror took over, Mengistu took over, he closed all the churches in Ethiopia and also the education, the whole system became communist, and the order with a communist government is they control everything. They control not only production, they control wages, and they control education. So for about 50 years they ruled, and they closed all the schools, and it was forbidden to even speak about the royal family. They murdered most of the royal family that stayed in Ethiopia. So a lot of them fled abroad into different parts of the world. And it was like a taboo to even mention His Majesty. So that created 50 years as a generation, almost two. And that created like these generations of these people who had no knowledge of the works that His Majesty did for them. And also, a lot of propaganda was fed into the education and just throughout Ethiopia. Constantly, propaganda was aired on the television. And this is why most of us in the diaspora, our parents' generation, they tell us, oh, His Majesty was a tyrant and he fed his lions meat and his people were starving. Is that same propaganda that spread throughout that time frame? So from my travels and my understanding in Ethiopia, it's because of that 50 years of the Derg ruling or communism rule in Ethiopia that put that stunt in the consciousness and development. Because when you see most of the elders, most of the patriots who fought during the war, they glorify His Majesty too. I had a personal experience of meeting His Majesty's royal jeweler, and he is the man who made most of the jewelry for His Imperial Majesty. He made John F. Kennedy's wife the golden purse that His Majesty gifted her with the Lion of Judah symbol. He also designed the tablet in Haile Selassie Church in Ethiopia.
May
And
I interrupt you though, Rashan, to ask a
yeah,
question?
yes,
This, I know, we know about the propaganda. We know how evil the propaganda of the Europeans can be.
hmm
But do you not think that having a personal jeweler, forget Ethiopia, let's
hmm
talk about across Africa, where
hmm
people are starving and suffering,
hmm
for a leader to have a personal jeweler, do you not think that some criticism in that vein would be justified?
I mean, if you are, not educated or you don't understand certain customs and traditions, because remember, His Majesty just wasn't a man, he wasn't a president, he wasn't a minister, he was an emperor, right? And an emperor of the most ancient monarchy on the world. His Majesty traced his lineage in the book called In the Country of the Blue Nile to King Sneferu. And King Sneferu was the builder of the Bent Pyramid, and his son, which is King Khufu, is a builder of the Great Pyramid that sits on the Giza Plateau. So within the Ethiopian tradition alone, every king has a royal jeweler that makes the crown, jewels, and so on and so forth. And this tradition, or this title of the jeweler, it passes down from father to son, and it goes back thousands of years. So it's not just like, oh, a rich man with a jeweler. No, it's a king. Every African king has a jeweler, or somebody that's in charge of the royal jewels or treasure. So it wasn't like, in that perspective, as, oh, a rich man just with a jeweler. you know so I would say, to go further, no. And what I was saying, I met the jeweler of His Majesty, and he himself told me His Majesty was the greatest man he ever known in his life. During the war, even prior to the war, His Majesty paid for him because he was a jeweler in Ethiopian tradition. But His Majesty paid for him to go to Europe and study abroad in modern metallurgy, to the making of jewelry and metal smelting and those kind of things. So His Majesty paid for his education from the crown, and he did that with most Ethiopians of that man's generation. And that's where that's what His Majesty did. He sent Ethiopians abroad to educate them and further their education to modern standards, and also they return to Ethiopia and they partake in the kingdom, in building of the kingdom.
Give thanks for that, Rashawn. As you were speaking, Rashawn, I remember a clip from a Bob Marley interview. I don't know if Kush or Dr. Kimo remembers this, where he was asked about the suffering Ethiopians, and Bob Marley just dismissed it and said, "Well, if you're in the king land and you're not obey or not do the right, then you for suffer." Does anyone remember that?
I don't remember it, but it's the truth, and it's the truth, because, and even that is questionable to say, okay, they were Ethiopians suffering, because prior to the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, yes, there was poverty throughout the land, but mainly because of lack of infrastructure, and that's what His Majesty was doing. Ethiopia was an isolated nation that sat in isolation for over 2,000 years until the modern day aircraft was invented. And because Ethiopia sits on a high mountain plateau, so it wasn't until man invented aeroplanes and perfected it that we were even able to get in contact with the Ethiopians. They isolated themselves for thousands of years. And prior to the invasion of Ethiopia, nobody was hungry. You know, Prior to the Europeans even colonizing Africa, in some texts is written that there was not even orphans. There wasn't even no words in many African language for orphan, or like, certain concepts that we have today in the West. No one was hungry. There was no crime. The streets were clean throughout Ghana, throughout Nigeria, and all of this ties together of like foreign invasion. When the Italians invaded Ethiopia, they bombed the earth with mustard gas and it poisoned the earth. So years later in the 90s, when we heard of the Ethiopian famine, it's because the earth was poisoned. So things didn't even start to show or manifest until later on. And just to add something extra, with the question you asked about His Majesty's life, representing, where you said, Kush said His Majesty life represents like all black man's life. And it's true, because His Majesty was born in 1892, and for exactly 400 years prior, in 1492, Christopher, the King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella got married, and that started the Spanish Inquisition. And Christopher Columbus set sail in 1492. And exactly 400 years later, in 1892, when His Majesty was born on the first day of Leo constellation, right? That um, it began the end of colonialism, or the rise of the African man or the black man. Give thanks.
Give thanks for that, Rashawn. You know, one of the mistakes that we make when we examine history is not understanding that every man and woman has to be judged within the context and time that they lived. And so much of the lies that are told on our leaders or kings or queens has to do with trying to hide or minimize the challenges that they faced within their leadership. So I want to talk about Italy, Mussolini, and some of the challenges Haile Selassie faced in trying to bring about the modernization of Ethiopia. He made his plea to the League of Nations, which were ignored for the most part, and he eventually had to flee from Ethiopia and seek refuge in England. I do recall many people frowned upon that move. And even people who look back at history, they say that, well, Haile Selassie, as great as he was pandering to white people. Marcus Garvey, I believe, remarked embarrassingly that Haile Selassie seeking refuge in the UK was that of a cowardly lion. I think he ended up regretting saying that. But I want to touch on this topic because so many people don't do the proper assessment of why Haile Selassie was making a plea to the League of Nations and why he eventually sought refuge in England. Kush, you want to take that one or start off?
All right, sure, thanks. Yeah, it's very important that we examine the time that Haile Selassie was here
Can you
and
project your
what was
voice a
going
little
on.
bit louder, Kush? I'm not hearing you.
Sorry, you hear? Sorry, you hear me better now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I was agreeing with you. That's very important for us to study the context of the time and what was going on. And before going, even before we reach Mussolini and all this problem, way before His Majesty became emperor, Ethiopia was facing a whole heap of problems. Now, the way a nation becomes powerful, even if outside of Europe, we were talking about Ghana, all these, the Ashanti nation, all these nations, because they could trade freely. They could trade with other groups within Africa and outside of Africa freely. They were able to traverse the land freely. They had access to the rivers and to the ocean freely. Ethiopia did not have that. But right around Ethiopia was controlled by outsiders and not verbally controlled. You step over the border, it's war. That's what it means. You go over the border, it's war. And this is what Ethiopia had to deal with. This is what His Majesty came into as a king. Now, after the pandering to Europeans, as a lot of Africans would put it, um, it's funny because when His Majesty wasn't the first king to go, or royalty to go over Europe, his father was one of the first to travel Europe, right? And traveling Europe, one thing that His Majesty noticed, or European made sure that His Majesty knew, that if we want, we can bomb your country. If we feel like doing it tomorrow morning, we can invade Ethiopia. And they made sure of this by showing him their military. Um, all their warships, all their planes, all their guns were on display when His Majesty went to Europe. Now, unless if you're a leader of millions of people, you're going to have to take that into consideration. Um, so going back to Ethiopia, one thing was clear to His Majesty, that no amount of spirituality, no amount of Christianity would keep Europeans out of Ethiopia if they want to invade Ethiopia. And that was one of the things that His Majesty wanted out of more than anything else, how to get Ethiopia ready to defend itself. And Ethiopia didn't make guns. Again, as I say, Ethiopia couldn't export or import materials from from Ghana, where Ghana was making iron because Ghana was under British control, and British has a law that they weren't trading with Ethiopia. You couldn't get dirt from Somalia because it was British Somalia. You couldn't get resources from Eritrea because Eritrea was under Ethiopia, was under Italian control. So what was a king had to do is almost like we're not taking account of what was going on. So even when His Majesty left Ethiopia, that was not that was a communal effort. Now, if His Majesty had stayed in Ethiopia, then the world would not know that Mussolini, or the first the first Italian godfather, was committing murder in Ethiopia. The world would not know that the Godfather was bombing, was dropping um, poisonous gas on Ethiopia, which was against international law. And that is important. If we're going to have nations within these nations, and a nation can men going to invade our nations. No matter how spiritual or emotional we get, we can't stop a next man thinking from wanting to invade you. What he can do is make it so it's going to be difficult for him. So, but we need an international law on that. And the international law did not include Africa. So they could do anything they want without the world morality knowing, the humanity of the world knowing. If His Majesty had stayed in Ethiopia, then what the Rastaman was saying wouldn't have happened. The Lion of Judah would not overcome. The Godfather would have leveled Ethiopia and maybe made Ethiopian people extinct. So it was very important that His Majesty went to the only ally. In the if you're fighting a war, it's simple. You use your enemy against your enemy. You use the big fish to get rid of the small fish until they can get rid of everybody. But and at the moment, the only person that Ethiopia had as an ally that would give them weapon was the British monarch. And it's two things that Haile Selassie had as option he had. One, say no to the British monarch and fight losing battle, or find ally so he can save trillions of people life.
And so,
I,
in the same way, Kush, Africans who are facing discrimination and punishment and capital punishment should feel okay going to the Privy Council in the UK to solve national problems.
well, the Privy Council doesn't give us guns. The Privy Council give us their way of law. When His Majesty was going to the European nation, he was going for guns. He wasn't going so he can put a system in place in Ethiopia. Ethiopia already had a system. His Majesty wasn't looking to Europe to modernize Ethiopia in their moral way or their system. No, he wanted trains and plane. That's all Europe had. They didn't have nothing else. They had plane, trains, and guns. And that's what His Majesty went for. And I don't see, up to now, I don't see nothing wrong with that. Because if you don't have guns in this modern time, a nation is going to invade you, no matter how much prayer you pray. So, yeah.
Dr. Kimo, how true is that Haile Selassie was not looking to the West, at least in part, for a way to fashion modernization of Ethiopia? My understanding is that many of the quote unquote improvements to Ethiopia was based on trying to imitate the Western system. Is that true or not true?
No, that couldn't be true because modernization come to Africa. Everything that the Western world actually understand and learn. As you talk about Europe, if you check France, England, Germany, those cathedrals was not created by Europeans. They were created by Africans. You have to remember the first settlers in Europe is African. Before any form of white people ever come on this planet, we were already here creating. Remember, even water to bathe with, bath, keeping the body clean, being healthy was also done by the Moors, not Europeans. Akhenaten was the one who educated so-called modern Europeans, what we call Moses. So if you talk about modernization, Europe has nothing to do with that. What Europe has, as Kush said, was ammunition. We were actually in Africa studying our high self, trying to rise to a spiritual entity, just like all the monks in China would go way up in the mountains to heighten themselves. We were not barbaric and evil. But here comes a people, if you study way back in the Council of Nicaea, way back with this Pharaoh kneel down in the desert and pray into the Almighty and said, there's a strange people that is among us that we do not know from whence they came. That was the so-called Europeans. And they come with one mindset to kill and destroy. So they master the killing methods how to build these things. Also, if you ask me, I would still tell you that it was not even them, it was still Africans who teach them how to do it. Because, just like every home you would have in a family, there's always a bad child in it. And that bad child always been radical and do things that they should not have done. So it is not they who modernize Africa. It is we actually who modernize them, and in turn they create these things. We see one teach it to them. We never have it in Ethiopia because we're not a barbaric nation. So as Kush said, that is exactly how it goes. Now we needed to defend ourselves, so we have to go to them that we never have none. Same thing if you look at the war with America and the Indians. They have bone and arrow. They never have no gun. When you fire a bone and arrow, 5 shot can take you a long time. So they have to form some form of alliance or some agreement to come together and say, all right, we're going to do some form of trading. And that's exactly what His Majesty did to defend himself.
Rashan, has Rasta forgiven Marcus Garvey for those terrible utterances against the king?
Wow,
Well,
wow, wow, wow.
Fag haven't.
You say, Kush?
So Ras Fagan haven't.
A lot of rascals haven't, to be honest with you. And living in the belly of the beast, living in America, those comments that Garvey made, it still has a rippling effect toward in us or towards us today, as far as division, because just reasoning, we call them RBG with the Garveyites here. They the when you say anything about His Majesty, the first thing that come out their mouth is what those words that Garvey spewed, you know, and trying to degrade the emperor, and it is the words of a traitor. At the time where Ethiopia was the black world, the last hope and kingdom of the black man, free man, was under attack. That Garvey, turned his back on His Majesty, and Garvey being a devout Catholic, whilst the Catholic Pope was invaded Ethiopia, as the Book of Revelation say. You know, they shall make war with the Lamb, but the Lamb shall overcome them, because He is King of kings and Lord of lords. And the mark of the beast being the number of a man, which is 666. And every Pope that sits on the throne of the Vatican, he carries the name Vicarius Filii Dei. And according to Latin Roman numerals, they are Romans, so they use Roman numerals to write. Every letter has a numeric value, and when you add up this title of the Pope, Vicarius Filii Dei, it gives us 666. So Garvey's word, I think, still has a ripple effect and still affects us to this very day, and it causes division, mostly amongst our Black African American brothers here in America, because most of them are, they stem from Garvey. Garvey was the first to come, not the first, but he had the most impactful visit here, as far as rising the black man's consciousness. So I think many of us don't even me, I have my views in regards. I think, he came in as a Judas, you know, but in regards to His Imperial Majesty, His Majesty forgave Garvey and was like a father, a forgiving father. And even when he laid a wreath in symbolism of forgiveness, and acceptance. But like Kush said, we have to take into perspective time frame. Garvey, to in his defense, um, his views or his consciousness of what was going on in the continent at the time of the war was limited. He wasn't getting mails. He wasn't receiving, you know, anything from Ethiopia, any messages. He was even at war with the Ethiopians here in Harlem, which is His Imperial Majesty's personal physician and his cousin, who started the Ethiopian World Federation. So even though His Majesty went to Europe, Garvey looked at it from his perspective, but not knowing that His Majesty didn't choose even himself to go to Europe. He fought against going to Europe. It was the royal court, the nobles, the princes, the priests who like basically coerced him. They said he wept when he got on the train. Empress Menen had to force him on the train to head to Djibouti, to head to Palestine. That was the first place he went, right? So even that, and to take it even further, the stay or the exile of His Imperial Majesty, it aligns spiritually with so many ancient African prophecies, because Asar, who was born in Ethiopia, who the Europeans know as Osiris, who is the first begotten of the dead, the one who rose from the dead according to ancient texts first. Asar, when he died, he went into the underworld and he stayed 5 years. And when he returned, he was able to sit upon the throne again. So even that is like it's in alignment with it. And the first place Asar visited when he left Ethiopia was Palestine, the same as His Imperial Majesty did. And to take it even further, His Majesty left, or the reason the nobles coerced him into leaving, because His Majesty was the one who was pushing Ethiopia to join the League of Nations, to have an international representation on world affairs. And because he was the most educated and the most like far-sighted one amongst the Ethiopians, he led Ethiopia out of the darkness into the light. And they were like, who understands them better than you? Who else could plead for the consciousness or the people of Ethiopia better than the emperor? And he broke tradition as being the first head of state to address the League of Nations, and being the only head of state in the world to address both the League of Nations and the United Nations. So, many Rastas don't forgive Garvey because the ripple effects it have to this day. And I would say the exile, it more was like on a moral perspective, because just like Kush said, Ethiopia didn't need the Europeans only for guns. And Ethiopia didn't make guns, and they still don't make guns to this day, because we are pro-life. So that's the only reason. His Majesty said, yeah, we need the West for the technology, which is both a benefit and like a detriment.
I'm going to make a plea on behalf of His Excellency Marcus Garvey, though, and ask that the races give him some leniency. If we're judging people, as you say, Rashan, given the time that they existed, I think I think he regretted those words before he passed away, transitioned, and I think it was said in ignorance and in haste. But I think we can give him some forgiveness. Something you mentioned about Empress Menen. One of the many things that Haile Selassie did, which we can see as revolutionary, was to insist that the Empress is crowned at the same time as his when he was in his coronation. Many historians have said that that move was in keeping of ancient Cushitic traditions, ancient Kemetic traditions, which Haile Selassie simply brought back and reinstated, affirming the value and presence of the feminine, of the woman. How should we interpret that in terms of Rastafari movement, that many have said is oppressive to women or is patriarchal in a negative way. How do we interpret that move from Haile Selassie and what it meant beyond the symbolism? Dr. Kimo, I don't know if you wanted to address that.
Well, it is one of the most beautiful things ever happened on the planet. I don't, as I said, in farmer history, I am not so versed in that part if there was such a thing happened before, but I think so. But what His Majesty did is to show the power of a woman. And our mother, Empress Menen, you see what she do in Jerusalem when she built those churches, and also those children who were treated very bad, those girls that was treated very bad, and she make so much beautiful environment for them to save them from the onslaught of evil people. So what His Majesty do is show the world that is a man and a woman again come together to make this world same peace and harmony. And without mama, what would we be? So that is just my little input in it. What I see it goes so far. A beautiful woman and a beautiful queen and our goddess.
Give thanks, Raskimo. Kush, it took a while, it seemed, for Rasta to hail Emperor Haile Selassie and Empress Menen simultaneously, even when it comes to chanting or just honoring the divinity that's coming out of that lineage. Do you think it's something that Rasta fought against, or they're finally accepting this idea of or what the king and queen crowning at the same time really meant or symbolized?
That's one of the, I wouldn't say contradiction, but I guess one of the issues that Rastafari has been dealing with is the Judeo-Christian idea of male, and the Rastafari movement insisting on a balance, even in the unconsciousness. So, even though there was a time when there wasn't the utterance of a balance wasn't being uttered in the movement, the most powerful entity within the movement, as in a force to be reckoned with, was Nyabingi, which was is a female element. So even though it was just it was a delicate process to get here, but as I said, the king already was doing that process when he decided to make that revolutionary move within the context of the time, because this was something that was an Ethiopian culture, and His Majesty was bringing forward what was once normal in Ethiopia. So it's a lot of things that His Majesty wanted to change. That was one of the things that he was making sure that he made sure that the world knew that this is one of the things that we are doing and changing over, that our king, our queen is going to be crowned with us, as showing that the balance or the equality, and also that we are striving to maintain or get back a pure Ethiopian or African tradition. Um, Again, the Rastafari movement is a process, and it's definitely accepting of the female element, even if it's just on an unconscious level.
Thank you for that, Kush. Ras Sean, did you want to respond?
Yes, definitely, definitely. In agreement with what the brethren just said, I would take it even further to yes, definitely from that Judo-Christian perspective, where everything is masculine, God is masculine, and in reality that is anti-African, because in ancient Africa, say contrary to the Judeo perspective, that a man the right like a king
inherits his right to rule from his father. In ancient Africa or Ethiopian civilization, excuse me, yeah,
Oh, sorry. I thought.
In
Mhm.
Ethiopian
Go ahead. Go ahead.
civilization, um it's matrilineal. Descent is passed down matrilineal. If I'm king, my son wouldn't be king, but the son of my sister would be the king, because the throne is a woman. Even Isis or Aset, she's symbolized in the hieroglyphics as a throne. That's her symbol, because the right is derived from the woman, just like Mary to Christ. It's through the woman we get ourselves or our power, and that's the way ancient African perspective always was. So Rasta, His Imperial Majesty came and restored the balance of masculine and feminine within every African spiritual system. There's a masculine God or aspect of God, and there's a feminine aspect, and that's nature. So His Majesty came and restored the nature or the balance to the nature. And I would even go further now to take it on a heights, because in the scriptures or the Bible, it tells you that Christ was walking and they were about to stone a harlot or a whore or someone who cheated on her husband. And when they were about to stone her, Christ said, let he who is free of sin cast the first stone. And no one couldn't throw a stone because no one was free of sin. And I would take it to His Imperial Majesty now, because Her Imperial Majesty wasn't a whore, but according to royal protocol, a king would marry a princess or a royal woman who was never married prior, or and to have children prior was like shameful and abhorrence. It was never heard of before. Every king prior to either married a virgin or a woman who was never married. Not only Her Imperial Majesty had children, but she was married twice before she was married to His Imperial Majesty, and she had children from the first and second marriage. So when His Imperial Majesty took Empress Menen and said, "I'm gonna marry her and make her my empress," a lot of noblemen and clergy was like abhorred. They were shocked, like, what is he doing? And into that same concept of let he who be free of sin cast the first stone. And even Emperor Menelik II, when he was crowned, he crowned Empress Taitu, but not on the same day, and he did it not in the church, and he himself crowned her. So when they heard Empress Menen would be crowned on the same day, it was like already argumentative, and like gossip started in the kingdom. But when His Majesty during coronation said to the high priest, who after placing a crown upon his head said, by the the pureness of Her Imperial Majesty, it is, I feel that the priest should crown her and not me, according to Ethiopian tradition. The emperor would crown the empress, but he asked that the Holy Father or the high priest of the church to crown Empress Menen because of her virtue. So His Imperial Majesty restored that divine balance. On coronation day, the official symbol of coronation was a portrait of His Imperial Majesty and Her Imperial Majesty together as one. And to even take it to a heights now, when Empress Menen was crowned Queen of Kings or Empress of Ethiopia, she was pregnant with a child. So the Holy Trinity, or the might of the Holy Trinity, was actually fulfilled because it was a man, woman, and child sitting on the throne at once. And it was the Holy Trinity sitting as the Godhead on the throne, man, woman, and child, because Her Imperial Majesty Empress Menen was pregnant at the time of coronation.
How beautiful. Thanks for that, Rashawn. I want to talk more about Haile Selassie, specifically as it relates to Rasta and Rastafari movement and what that signifies and what it means. Now, there is sometimes a little bit of back and forth about whether Rasta is pro-black or whether Rasta is a one love movement. And what I find is a lot of the Rastas or people who sit on the side of Rasta is one love, Rasta love all races, you can marry out of your race, you can do whatever you want. They are the ones who typically use Haile Selassie's life, Haile Selassie's words to justify the fact that Rasta is a one love movement. So even earlier when Dr. Kimo mentioned, the fact that that famous speech by Haile Selassie was indicative of the fact that we are all one race. A lot of Rastas use these words to say we can marry outside of our race. Pan Africanism through the eyes of Haile Selassie means love white people. Some people say a white man can be a Rasta. Is this something that is welcomed in the Rasta community? This view of Haile Selassie as opening the door to all races? Or is Haile Selassie still a relevant figure when it comes to pro blackness and Pan Africanism? Anyone want to jump in?
Yeah, yeah. I guess I'll jump in the first. I don't see what's all right. A lot of people find an issue with His Majesty quoting or saying or looking out for humanity. Eh? Whether it be saying that all humanity deserve peace or all humanity deserve, which nothing is wrong with that. I think we kind of a lot of people kind of mixing up the issue are using someone identifying or acknowledging next to the people humanity, meaning that they they want to mix for lack of a better word. All right. Now the thing about Rastafari movement was that the only thing that it should have or was supposed to prove or was supposed to show was that it can be a black conscious movement with a black king, black God, black Africa, whatever, and still coexist in the world. Still could coexist with other movement, could coexist with other government, coexist with other culture. It didn't mean that we had to become something else. You could still have that core love or concept of Africa and the movement.
But Kush, if we look at words from people like Leonard Howell, who is regarded as the first Rasta, he explicitly says that white people are the enemy,
Oh, sorry, repeat
and a
that.
lot of people. Leonard Howell, explicitly says that white people are the enemy, and a lot of people would say that that idea of another race being your enemy is very anti what Haile Selassie represents.
I guess quotes. These are sorry, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but a lot of people like to read quotes and turn it into a book. So a man read a quote and you will think that is an entire book. Again, if His Majesty state that Italians they should and Germany shouldn't be invading Italy because it is wrong. It doesn't mean that His Majesty um, wants to become white or prefer white. Now, even though His Majesty is saying this, His Majesty is also saying that African people needs to get gun because European country will not stop invading African country unless we have guns. So yeah, nothing is wrong with us talking as brothers, as human brothers, but at the same time, His Majesty was very clear that until African nations have a military or develop their own military, develop their own ways of making their own defense weapon, then there will always be an opening for European countries to take over Africa, aka white man is the enemy. But you won't find a diplomat or a king saying that. So that is why that is why when Garvey said what he said, the king did not respond. He just tell Garvey, say, listen man, Garvey, it's okay. We don't need to meet because you diss the king. But there is no need to cause a conflict because they know the relevance of Garvey. Garvey was very important. So as a king, you don't push, as the African would say, you don't push wood in a fire. You simply dismiss it and go about the business of African people. And Garvey knew his mistake and came to apologize, but the king says it's all right. And most of these speeches that after the ones them are using to justify whether go against Leonard Owl or go against no for the first Rastas or Rassis that was putting forth certain philosophy is quotes. There is no speech that Haile Selassie made about Europe and Africa where he did not say African nation needs to find a way to protect themselves against European. And as I say, in a lot, if you should boil that down, it simply means our enemies are white people and we have to find a way to protect ourselves because they will smile in your face today and invade your country tomorrow.
Dr. Kimo, is that a fair interpretation of His Majesty's position on international relations?
Well, I would say, and it can be questioned, what we get from His Majesty is just what we receive. Everything that is said, that is written, that is what we understand. But outside of that, we cannot quote from his mind perfectly. God, he's God himself. Now, why I say that white people are the Caucasian, yes, are invaders. That is not something you're going to get rid of anytime soon. But within the human community, among ourselves, the same thing happening daily. We kill our one another rapidly, fast, without even blinking an eye. So His Majesty always talk about inside the human community. How can we agree one to another and find this peace and balance among ourselves? His Majesty went to Europe is not because he wanted to go. Somebody make a point. He was forced to go. Guy didn't want to leave. But he knows the law and how it is, and he never want to break much things apart. So he went for many, many purposes, even to even help fuse out Hitler at the time that was coming across to capture other places in Europe. He's the one who stopped that also. And we know how evil European is, but yet he still employed them to fight in his war against them same way. You understand me? So in Rasta who say as the question was point first, if a white man can be a Ras, of course he can. It's not much of the color of the man's skin, but his character. Is how the man conduct himself, how the man behave, that make the person, that individual unique. If that individual can find a God self within himself, because he's still a soul, yeah, walking and moving. If he can find that, then he's welcome. That question was asked also of Yeshua in the Bible. Can a white man enter heaven? And he said, everyone is welcome. Everyone, the Gentiles, all of them is welcome. And to me, from my little understanding, is that is not much of the color, the look of a man's eyes, really the character, the person that the individual really is. If a question been asked, if would you marry a white woman? No, because I'm an African, and the white man having white woman, the Chinese man having Chinese woman. Me want African woman. It have nothing to do with disrespectful. It's just who you are, and that's how you feel.
Thank you, Dr. Kimo. Rashawn, can a Rasta be white?
Um, well, my opinion is Rastafari is an African spiritual system, and it is for made by us for us, and for a European to say, he can hail a king, he can, give reverence and those kind of things, but to be actually, Rastafari, I would say it's questionable. It's very I don't think so. I don't think so. But you know, going off of what His Majesty perspective is that, just reading one of his quotes. Above all, Ethiopia is dedicated to the principle of equality of all men, irrespective of difference of race, color, or creed, as we do not practice or permit discrimination with. Sorry about that. Yeah, as we do not practice practice or permit discrimination within or our nation, so we oppose it wherever it is found. And basically saying that all men are viewed equal. There's, like you said, there's good and bad in all people, right? But when it comes to these things now, like our spiritual systems and our ideas, Rastafari is against colonialism, is against white supremacy. So, not to say a white can be against white supremacy, but Rastafari, even to take it further, like from African perspective, the first mention of Rasta, right, is in the Pert M. Heru, which is the book. The Europeans call it the Book of the Dead because they found it in the hands of our ancestors in their tombs, and every ancestor had a book on their chests, so they call it the Book of the Dead, but it's really called the Book of Coming Forth from the Darkness to the Light. And the first mention of Rasta was a spiritual place according to the ancient Ethiopians. It was the place between the living and the dead. It was a kind of astral plane, and every being after they transition from the flesh, they go into the spiritual realm and they have to make it past the Rasta plane, and the Rasta plane is guarded by a lion. So taking it further, it's an ancient African perspective. It's just manifested or you know revitalized itself in our times. So I would say no. We welcome them. You can hail the king because he is God Almighty. He is the king. He is the ruler of the earth. So they must give reverence. Who am I to say, you know, they can't or not? But going off what His Imperial Majesty said, he said that religion is personal. Religion is personal, and the state is for the people. The government is for the people. So who am I to tell the next man what he can do? But from my perspective, it maybe even yes, but to a limited standard or to a limited degree.
I think as Africans, it's very dangerous for us to, as you said, confuse the political and the religious. And of course, we can't tell another man who to bow to and who to pray to. But certainly, I think even history will confirm that this perspective of we are all one and no discrimination has led to the infiltration of Rasta in Jamaica. When you had people like Brother Love, that white man from Florida that came into Jamaica, set up organization, and was welcomed with open arms and did a lot of damage to Rastafari philosophy because of this idea that we are open and accepting to everyone. So I would love to see the concept of palace picnic that is implemented amongst black people, amongst each other. I would love to see that concept of palace picnic being implemented towards white people. So you're free to worship Haile Selassie if you will, but within the palace, within the organization, within the close ranks of those of us fighting for our freedom or to restore Ethiopia, all of Ethiopia, which is all of Africa, to its rightful glory. I can't see why we would welcome them into that fold, standing on the principles of African unity and African redemption. I cannot see what reason we'd have to welcome them into the fold. Kush, what are your thoughts on white rastas?
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely an infiltration that happened. Um, the as I said, the movement, studying the movement within its time, it was very important to have an answer You know, whether we want to call it a reactionary movement or a reactionary move, we need a reaction to what was going on. We need a reaction to the exploitation of African people. That's it's simple and plain. And we were being exploited on every level that's possible. We were being exploited on every level. So the movement, when it came about, was solely for the liberation of African people. Now, if what we needed to show, and what the movement needed to show, was that within this concept of Africanness, this concept of black king, African God, African as the glory land, is that it didn't bring forth racism. It didn't bring forth exploitation. It, the world needed to know that there was or there can be a movement that was that in love with itself and in love with its people and want the freedom of its people, but still doesn't equate to exploitation, which which was expressing. So they were proud of being Europeans, bringing their European culture all across the world, but at the same time it leads to exploitation and leads to murder and leads to rape. So that's all the Rastafari movement was needed to show on a humanitarian level, right? The infiltration started to happen when uh, I guess our leadership trying to start to change a bit, but they started to change everything around. So the one love is from Garvey, and Garvey is the one that uttered black for black. So if Garvey uttered black for black, and Garvey was saying one love, then automatically one love must mean all African people should love themselves under one love, one heart. But again, the infiltration happened that one love now start to mean that you're not only your humanity, but you're willing to erase your race or erase your identity because you love all humanity. So that's how infiltration is happening or is happening.
Thank you for that, Kush. Dr. Kimo, there are many things that people don't know about Haile Selassie. As we wrap up tonight's podcast, can you just share with us something that you feel is very important that many people either we don't know about His Majesty or is not celebrated enough about him? Can you share that with us, please?
Yes, Princess. Well, as humans, and His Majesty is our Almighty, my personal um, voice on it is that is to know Him much better. We studied Him, His writing, His teaching, but knowing Him, well, I've met, and I will say this. People ask me many times when I say this that I have met His Majesty, like literally walk with Him in Ethiopia. And people ask me, how is that possible? You just born the other day, His Majesty disappeared. That is how people feel. But if you meditate on who you know as the Almighty, He will come to you. It happened in a plane, and it happened right in my home in Clarendon. And so knowing this person as how I know my son or my daughter, that's how I know him personal, walk and talk, and the things will happen. And I said, this is the Almighty to me. As a matter of fact, I could say my father at one time, maybe not in this generation, but still is. But me, like, just in Ethiopia, I would have a son from Empress Menen. I see him as that person. I was a son to him at one point in a former life. And he returned, even in this life, to bless me, touch me on my left shoulder, and renew my spirit. So when you hear I speak a certain type of way, because that's the way that I learned to speak from him. We as person, and when we say we mean not just an individual aspect, we are many people in one person. And these are the knowledge that we gain from His Majesty. So my thing is know him personally. That him can visit you and talk to you. That is what I get because I have met him and talked to him. If another human being can get him like that, talk to him in person, you will a whole another chapter of your life will open up if you just know him as a person. Trust me. That is it for me.
Give thanks, Dr. Kimmel. Rashawn,
Yes, I would just like to share the information His Majesty away, and it's very significant spiritually, and His Majesty birthday coincides with the first day of Leo. All right, the first day of the Leo entering the Leo constellation, and also um, Sirius, the Sirius star correlates with His Majesty as well, the brightest star in our sky. And according to the Dogon, Sirius A and B is the center of our universe, and they call it the dog star. And His Majesty was well known to have many dogs as pets, and he loved dogs. So to add to that, the Nile Valley flood, the flood of the Nile in ancient days would begin on His Majesty's birthday. That's when the inundation would come down from the hills of Ethiopia to reach the wetlands of Egypt or the delta of Egypt. And his birthday is very significant spiritually in across all religions and all spiritual systems. So that's what I wanted to share. Like a lot of people isn't aware. They think it's just regular birthday. No, it's as above, so below. And the brightest star in the sky, which is Sirius, it shines. It rises before the sun on that particular day. You know, it light reaches us before the sun on that day.
thank you so much for that, Rashawn. Kush, is there any one particular thing you think we need to highlight more about Haile Selassie or something that we don't talk about enough?
Um, yeah, I think the love that Haile Selassie had for Africa and African people and African culture, and the efforts that he was making to bring African people and Africa back to its original, whether it be spirituality, economical way of coexisting with each other. So I think that we need to highlight more His Majesty love of the continent and what he did, the work that he did throughout that time to bring the continent together. I've noticed that at that time we spent a time on the few time when he visited outside of Africa and whatever, but we don't discuss the fact that he was part of the ones that who started the, I think is the Africa, the AU, if I'm not mistaken, and was
Yes, he
integral.
was. Yes.
Yes, he was, and integral into in other areas or other movements and programs that was pushing forth for African union within an economical or political or spiritual sense. So and I think we should focus a lot more on how His Majesty was integral in African politics and Africa becoming leader in its own political environment.
And also, we should never minimize the honor. Oh, yes, the OAU. Thank you, Rashawn. That was the organization that Haile Selassie formed, I believe, along with Nkrumah. But we should never minimize or allow the writers of history to minimize the great honor that Haile Selassie paid to the people of Jamaica, the Rastafari of Jamaica, whom at the time were the underclass, the downtrodden, the rejects, the people who were seen as mad, dirty, filthy, unworthy. Haile Selassie, King of Kings, paid these people a great honor by coming to visit them. That's no small thing. That's not something that should be simply dismissed as some kind of state visit. Haile Selassie came to visit the people who call themselves by his name. And I think it's very relevant, and it speaks to the kind of statesman he was, and it speaks to the honor and his undying love for African people globally. And finally, I want to remind everyone that speech that is often quoted and used mistakenly to further One Love hippie aims. That speech that was an address to the United Nations. Haile Selassie wasn't addressing black people when he was reminding them of the equality of races. He was speaking to white people. He was telling white people that until bigotry and prejudice and malicious and inhuman self interest have been replaced by understanding and tolerance and goodwill, until all Africans stand and speak as free beings, equal in the eyes of all men as they are in the eyes of heaven. Until that day, the African continent will not know peace. Africans will fight if necessary, and we know that we shall win as we are confident in the victory of good over evil. So let it be very clear that His Majesty was addressing the bigotry which African people were forced to live under due to European subjugation, due to the lack or the failure to act by the United Nations, specifically as it relates to tyrants like Mussolini and other European so called powers. He wasn't speaking to black people and telling black people, oh, just don't mind the color of your brother's eyes. No, 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 no. He was speaking specifically to a racist organization. And I think we tend to forget that. And the call that was made then is still relevant today. We Africans will fight if necessary. And we know that we shall win as we are confident in the victory of good over evil. Thank you, everyone who joined. I am very happy that you were able to share your thoughts and share your knowledge. I learned so much this evening, and we give thanks and we give praises. Have a good evening, everyone. Until next week for another edition of the Truth Gangsters podcast.